The way this whole story begins still gives me chills, because honestly, nobody expected Prince Harry, of all people, to ever open up about something so sensitive, so quietly devastating, and so deeply tangled in the past that even he didn't fully understand it at first. And yet here we are, with a revelation that didn't come crashing out in a dramatic tell-all, but instead slipped out in those raw, private moments with people he trusted. Moments where he finally admitted that the pressure behind Meghan's empty wedding seats was way darker, way heavier, and way more complicated than anyone outside the situation ever realized. Think back to that wedding. The whole world was watching. Analysts, commentators, royals, fans, critics, everyone staring at every frame as Meghan walked down that aisle. But while the cameras zoomed in on the dress and the vows and all the fairy tale energy, there was something quietly screaming from the sidelines. Something you couldn't unsee once you noticed. Meghan's entire section, empty. A whole side of that massive historic chapel left bare except for one woman sitting there with this unbelievable calm. Doria Ragland alone. Completely alone. No siblings, no uncles, no cousins, nobody filling the rows behind her. Just Doria, straight across from the Queen. That visual wasn't subtle. That was a statement dripping with tension and questions. People whispered, experts speculated, but nobody, absolutely nobody, understood why that side was left like a ghost town until now. Because it turns out the reason Meghan's family wasn't there wasn't drama, wasn't simple estrangement, wasn't logistics, and wasn't some Hollywood twist. It was a secret, a heavy, generational, deeply sensitive secret, buried not in Meghan's public life, but in her ancestry. And it all starts with a single missing name, a name so deliberately erased that it became the loudest silence in her entire family history. When Meghan and Harry announced their engagement, British newspapers did what they always do. They printed a full genealogical chart for the soon-to-be royal, and everything seemed orderly. Names, dates, places, the typical polished royal-approved structure, until your eyes landed on one bizarre, impossible blank line right where Doria's mother's name should be. Nothing. Just a void, a gap that should never exist in a family tree, especially one run through royal vetting. Experts noticed immediately. Archivists raised eyebrows. Genealogists were stunned. You don't accidentally forget a mother. Someone didn't want that name printed. And what made it weirder? That same blank wasn't just in one place. It appeared across different documents, different sources, different formats. Every version dodged the exact same question. Who was Doria's mother? And why was her identity so carefully erased? This wasn't some clerical error. It was a message. And honestly, that message became a warning once people started digging. Because while Meghan was stepping into her new spotlight, her past, or more specifically, the past of one woman in her lineage, was fighting to stay buried. And everything, absolutely everything, leads back to Janet Arnold, a name that didn't even appear publicly until after the wedding. 8 months after, to be exact. That's when the missing grandmother was finally identified in official records. Janet Arnold, born 1929 in Ohio, died 2000. At first glance, it looked innocent, an overdue correction. But the second researchers got her name, the entire family tree lit up with records, birth certificates, church logs, cemetery files, county data, and instead of things getting clearer, the story twisted into something far more shocking. Dates didn't align, names overlapped where they shouldn't, branches crossed back into themselves, and slowly, horrifically, the truth formed. Janet Arnold's parents, James T. Arnold and Natalie Nettie Mae Allen, were half-siblings, both children of the same woman, Gertrude Elizabeth Sadler. The exact same grandmother listed twice, the same woman appearing in two places where she should only be once. This wasn't distant. It wasn't ambiguous. It wasn't rumor. This was direct, immediate. A generational wound that had been quietly sealed away, hidden from public record, and erased from documents for decades, and suddenly the blank space made perfect sense. The omission wasn't random. It was protection or concealment, depending on who you ask, but either way, it was intentional. The kind of silence that families choose when the truth is too heavy, too complicated, or too dangerous to expose. Now imagine this discovery landing inside the royal household. Royal genealogical vetting is intense. Every marriage into the monarchy requires a full examination, historical, cultural, biological. And when the findings about Janet Arnold's parentage reached senior staff, the tone reportedly shifted from curiosity to containment. People weren't gossiping. They were strategizing, privately, quietly, all behind closed doors. Harry was briefed, not with drama, not with accusations, but with cold, factual implications. This wasn't about blaming Meghan or Doria. They didn't choose their ancestry, but the optics, the public reaction, the media frenzy that would follow if this came out, the potential headlines. The monarchy has survived wars, scandals, abdications, but this kind of revelation could overshadow everything, and so a plan formed: remove Janet's parentage from charts. List her name but not her origins. reduce attention on Doria's extended family, limit relatives at the wedding, keep Meghan's family circle tiny, tight, contained, predictable, safe, a full side of the chapel, empty by design, because an empty row is easier to control than a row full of unpredictable people who might talk, connect dots, or answer the wrong questions after a glass of champagne. And in the center of all this, Meghan and Doria. Carrying a silent history they never asked for, Doria has always carried herself with this quiet dignity. She appears briefly, deliberately. A wedding arrival, a documentary cameo, a short public moment, and then she disappears back into her private life. That kind of distance isn't typical for a mother whose daughter married into the most powerful family in Europe. But for Doria, silence wasn't coldness, it was survival. A way of guarding a story she had lived with her entire life. A story she had no desire to relive in front of billions. Meghan's boundaries with her extended relatives? Same pattern. Not hostility. Removal. A protective distance. A wall built out of necessity, not ego. Because once Janet's name resurfaced, the whole tree started exposing patterns someone had tried desperately to hide. And when generational scars run that deep, you learn to protect your peace by keeping certain doors closed. And that wedding day, that single image of Doria sitting by herself, suddenly becomes the loudest symbol of all. Because those empty seats behind her weren't just absent relatives. They were decades of erased records, missing names, silent generations, and painful history that had never been acknowledged. When the cameras panned across St. George's Chapel, people saw a fairy tale. But the real story sat quietly in those empty rows. A story stretching back through Janet Arnold, through James, through Nettie May, straight to a grandmother whose name appeared twice in a family tree where it should have appeared once. A story the palace couldn't rewrite, a story Meghan couldn't escape. And when Harry finally, hesitantly began admitting the truth to people close to him, he didn't talk about drama or feuds or estrangement. He talked about pressure complexity, a history he himself was still trying to process. Because that blank space on the chart? It wasn't blank at all. It was a wound. A wound passed through generations in silence. A wound that shaped Meghan's life long before she ever knew she'd become a duchess. A wound that sat quietly at a royal wedding, disguised as empty chairs. And here's the thing people still don't grasp. Even now, years later, those empty chairs at the wedding weren't just a symbol. They were the consequence of generations of silence that started long before Meghan was born, long before Doria ever became a mother, long before Harry ever imagined marrying an American actress. This was a story stitched into the bloodline, wrapped in shame, fear, and an unspoken agreement that some truths should never meet daylight. And when you look closely at how everyone behaved, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. When Janet Arnold's identity finally resurfaced, 8 whole months after the wedding, it didn't just fill a blank space, it cracked open an entire hidden world. Because the moment her name appeared, the records followed. And the moment the records appeared, the tangled truth behind her parents came rushing out. James T. Arnold and Nettie Mae Allen weren't distant cousins. They weren't linked by some complicated, misunderstood family tie. They were half-siblings, both children of Gertrude Elizabeth Sadler, one grandmother, 2 children. And from those 2 children came one daughter, Janet. The secret no one dared to speak. The wound everyone tiptoed around, the missing link that explained everything the palace scrambled to conceal. Imagine being in Harry's shoes, sitting in some quiet room behind palace walls, listening to advisors gently, carefully explain what this meant, not in some sensationalized tone, but in the cold, factual language of royal protocol. They weren't blaming Meghan, they weren't implying wrongdoing, but the monarchy is obsessed with lineage. And this kind of genealogical twist, it was catastrophic from an optics standpoint. A bomb that, if ever exposed, would send shockwaves through every media outlet, every headline, every whispering circle of royal watchers around the world. So the strategy became simple. Do not let the story breathe. Do not let the tree expand. Do not risk a cousin, an aunt, a relative appearing publicly and connecting dots they didn't even know existed. Less family equals less risk. Empty seats equals control. Silence equals safety. And then there was Doria, poised, composed, almost eerily calm during that wedding. She carried herself like someone who has lived her entire life protecting something delicate. Someone who knows that too many questions can unravel too much. Her graceful distance wasn't an accident. It was a lifetime of learned caution. You don't survive a family history like hers without mastering silence. And Meghan, whether consciously or subconsciously, adopted the same pattern. Keep the circle small. Keep the boundaries firm. Keep the past in the past. By the time the world saw Doria sitting alone at St. George's Chapel, the real story had already been cemented. The palace didn't want unpredictable relatives talking to the press, wandering into conversations, revealing family anecdotes that might accidentally hint at something deeper. Because the truth is, once the identity of Janet Arnold was confirmed, the family tree didn't just illuminate, it exposed, it revealed something so sensitive, so generationally painful, that erasing it became easier than explaining it, easier than acknowledging it, easier than letting it define Meghan's entry into the royal world. And Harry, God, you can almost feel the way this weighed on him. He didn't marry Meghan to inherit her history, but he did inherit the responsibility of protecting her from the world's brutality. And when he finally opened up, quietly, cautiously, the words weren't dramatic. They were heavy. He talked about complexity, pressure, how he didn't understand the truth at first either, how the story behind that missing name wasn't scandal, it was survival, and how a blank line on a genealogical chart held more pain than anyone outside the family could ever imagine. And it all leads to the same haunting truth. Those empty wedding seats weren't empty. They were filled with secrets, filled with silence, filled with a century of buried history that shaped everything. From Doria's guarded presence to Meghan's boundaries to the palace's fear, a blank wasn't a mistake. It was a shield, one that protected the past and haunted the present.